You have been your own worst enemy, and you probably already know it. Not because you are weak or broken or beyond help, but because the human mind was built with a hidden flaw, one that turns your greatest protector into your most reliable obstacle. You set a goal and then find reasons it will not work. You get close to something good and then quietly destroy it. You tell yourself you want change, but every time change comes knocking, something inside you slams the door and pretends no one is home. This is not bad luck. This is not bad character. This is the mind doing what it was wired to do, and understanding that wiring is the only way to break free of it. This audiobook is about the architecture of self-sabotage. It is about the invisible mechanisms that keep smart, capable, well-meaning people stuck in cycles they cannot seem to escape, no matter how hard they try. It is about the fear that wears the costume of laziness. It is about the comfort that masquerades as contentment. It is about the stories you tell yourself that feel like wisdom but are actually walls. Each chapter will take you deeper into a different part of the trap so that when you see it operating in your own life, you will finally have a name for it. If you are enjoying this audiobook and want to continue building real communication confidence, subscribe to this channel now. More chapters are coming, and each one will guide you step by step through mastering every conversation. Chapter 1. The Architecture of the Trap. Every trap has a design. It does not matter whether it is built from wood and steel or from thoughts and habits. Something constructed the trap, something maintains it, and something keeps the person inside it from seeing the walls clearly enough to find the door. The trap this book is about is the one most people never examine, even though they live inside it every single day of their lives. It is the internal structure that makes growth feel dangerous, that makes staying small feel safe, and that makes the same comfortable mistakes repeat themselves with such dependable regularity that a person starts to mistake the repetition for their personality. The first thing to understand about the mind's trap is that it was not built to hurt you. This is the part that surprises people when they first hear it. The mechanisms that create self-sabotage were designed, by evolution and by early experience, to protect you. The brain's number one job is not to make you happy. It is not to help you succeed or grow or fulfill your potential. Its number one job is to keep you alive. And to do that job effectively, it developed a deep and powerful preference for the familiar over the unknown, for the safe over the exciting, for the predictable over the promising. Think about what the brain is actually doing when you approach something new and potentially good. A job opportunity that could change your life. A relationship that could go deep. A creative project that could show the world something real about who you are. From your conscious mind's perspective, these things are opportunities. But from the brain's older, faster, survival-focused systems, they are threats in disguise. They involve uncertainty. They involve exposure. They involve the possibility of failure, or rejection, or loss. And the brain treats those possibilities with the same ancient alarm it would use for a physical predator. This mismatch between what the modern mind wants and what the ancient brain fears is the root architecture of the trap. The conscious self reaches toward growth, while the deeper systems pull back toward safety. And most of the time, the deeper systems win. Not because they are right, but because they are faster, louder, and far more practiced at running the show. The deliberate, thoughtful part of the mind is like a new employee trying to change company culture. It has ideas and energy, but the organization has decades of established habits that don't change because someone new showed up with a vision. The trap also has a structural reinforcement built into it that makes it particularly difficult to dismantle. Every time self-sabotage occurs and a person retreats from growth back to the familiar, the brain registers that retreat as a successful survival strategy. You approached the scary thing. You pulled back. You are still alive and intact. The brain draws a conclusion. Retreating works. And so the next time a growth opportunity arrives, the retreat signal fires even faster and with even more force, because the brain has additional evidence now that retreat is the correct response to this type of stimulus. There is also the matter of identity. The trap is not just a behavioral pattern. It is embedded in the story a person tells about who they are. The person who believes they are not the kind of person who succeeds does not just sabotage individual opportunities. They sabotage opportunities in order to confirm the story, because the brain has a powerful drive for internal consistency. Dissonance, the gap between what is happening and what is believed about the self, feels genuinely uncomfortable, and the mind will work hard to close that gap. Sometimes it closes it by changing the belief. Far more often, it closes it by changing the behavior to match the belief. Understanding the architecture of the trap is not the same as escaping it. Knowledge alone does not break the pattern. But without understanding the structure, every attempt at change is essentially random. You are pushing against walls without knowing where the walls are. You are looking for exits without a map of the building. The chapters ahead will give you that map, piece by piece, until you can walk through your own mind with enough clarity to see the mechanisms for what they are, and find, in the seeing, the beginning of a genuine way out. The most important thing to carry into everything that follows is this: you are not uniquely broken. The trap is not a sign of weakness specific to you. It is a feature of the human mind that operates in virtually everyone to varying degrees. The most successful people you can think of have all encountered it. Some found their way through, some found ways to work with it rather than against it, and all of them began with the same first step, which is the one you are taking right now, by choosing to look at the thing honestly, rather than continuing to pretend it is not there. Chapter 2. The comfort zone is a lie. The comfort zone is one of the most misunderstood concepts in popular psychology. Most people picture it as a circle with a safe, warm center and a scary outer edge. And the advice they are given is to push past that edge as often and as aggressively as possible. This picture is not entirely wrong, but it misses something crucial about what the comfort zone actually is, why it exists, and why the simple instruction to push past it fails so consistently for so many people who genuinely try to follow it. The comfort zone is not just a place you choose to stay in. It is a zone that actively pulls you back with real force every time you step outside it. What most people call the comfort zone is actually what researchers and psychologists call the window of tolerance, a range of emotional and physiological arousal within which a person can function effectively. Inside this window, you can think clearly, make decisions, connect with other people, and take action. Too far below the window, and you fall into numbness, disconnection, and shutdown. Too far above it, and you enter a state of overwhelm, panic, or reactive behavior driven by the survival brain rather than the thinking mind. The comfort zone is not laziness. It is the range within which your nervous system can operate in a regulated, functional way. When someone pushes dramatically past their comfort zone without adequate preparation or support, they do not usually grow. They overwhelm their nervous system and trigger the survival response. The brain registers the experience as dangerous, and the next time anything resembling that experience approaches, the alarm fires even earlier and more intensely. This is why a person who forces themselves through a terrifying public speaking experience without any real preparation does not usually become a confident speaker. They often become someone with a stronger aversion to public speaking than they had before, because the brain has now added fresh traumatic data to its threat files. The comfortable version of comfort zone thinking also contains a paradox that people rarely examine. The things that feel most comfortable, the routine, the familiar, the predictable, are not actually comfortable in any deep sense. They are simply known. There is a profound difference between genuine comfort, which involves ease, satisfaction, and peace, and the kind of numb familiarity that the brain prefers simply because it has been processed before. Many people are not actually comfortable in their comfort zone. They are simply less immediately frightened there. That distinction matters enormously when you are trying to understand why people stay stuck. Real growth does not happen at the edge of the comfort zone or beyond it. It happens right at the boundary, in repeated small excursions into the slightly unfamiliar that are close enough to the known to be manageable and far enough from it to create genuine expansion. This is what exposure therapy teaches. This is what behavioral activation and depression treatment demonstrates. This is what every serious athlete and musician and craftsperson knows from practice. Sustainable growth is incremental. It happens in the narrow band between too easy and too overwhelming, and staying in that band requires more precision and self-knowledge than the motivational advice about comfort zones ever bothers to provide. The lie the comfort zone tells is that staying inside it is the safe choice. But the evidence of people's actual lives tells a different story. The person who stays in the comfortable job they have stopped growing in does not avoid pain. They accumulate a different kind of pain, the pain of stagnation, the low hum of a life that feels smaller than what it could have been, the quiet resentment of a self that was capable of more and was never allowed to find out. The comfort zone is not a refuge from suffering. It is a trade, and like all trades, it has a cost that needs to be weighed honestly. There is also something the comfort zone does to identity that happens so slowly, people rarely notice it happening. The longer a person stays within a narrow range of behavior and experience, the more that range starts to feel like who they are, rather than what they have practiced. The person who has not tried anything new in years begins to believe they are simply not an adventurous person. The person who has avoided difficult conversations for a decade begins to believe conflict is just not something they can handle. But these are not personality traits. They are calcified habits. And calcified habits can be broken down with the right tools and enough patience. Rethinking the comfort zone begins with honesty about what is actually being protected by staying in it. Not lazy, dishonest honesty. Real honesty. What specific thing are you afraid would happen if you moved toward the thing you keep avoiding? Not the vague fear, not the general discomfort, but the specific story. If I try this and fail, it will mean what exactly? If I step toward this and it does not work, what then? When you get honest about the actual fear underneath the comfortable avoidance, two things often happen simultaneously. The fear becomes more manageable because it becomes specific, and the comfort zone becomes less appealing because you can finally see what you are actually trading your growth for. Chapter 3. Fear with a different face. Fear is easy to recognize when it looks the way movies show it. The racing heart, the cold sweat, the person frozen in place while something terrible approaches. That kind of fear is unmistakable. But the fear that lives inside the mind's trap does not usually look like that. It is wearing disguises, so convincing that most people walk past it every single day without ever recognizing it for what it is. It shows up as procrastination. It shows up as perfectionism. It shows up as suddenly getting very busy right when a good opportunity arrives. It shows up as picking fights with people you love right when the relationship gets genuinely close and vulnerable. Fear with a different face is still fear. And until you can recognize it, regardless of what costume it is wearing, you cannot address it. Procrastination is probably the most common disguise fear wears. The standard explanation for procrastination is that the person is lazy or lacks discipline. But this explanation does not hold up well against the actual evidence. Chronic procrastinators are often not lazy at all. They are people who work very hard at everything except the specific thing they keep putting off. And what is almost always true about the specific thing they are avoiding is that it matters to them deeply. The stakes are high. The possibility of failure would actually hurt. The project that keeps getting postponed is usually not trivial, but significant. And it is the significance itself that makes starting it so threatening. Perfectionism is fear wearing the costume of high standards. The perfectionist looks from the outside and often from the inside as well, like someone who cares deeply about quality. And caring about quality is genuinely good. But perfectionism is not actually about quality. It is about protection. If the work is never quite finished, it can never be fully judged. If the standard is set so impossibly high that meeting it is impossible, then falling short does not count as real failure because the standard was never achievable in the first place. Perfectionism is a system for staying permanently in preparation without ever having to face the exposure of completion. Self-sabotage in relationships carries a particular kind of fear disguise. People who have been hurt before, who grew up in homes where love was unpredictable or conditional or painful, often develop an unconscious system for destroying intimacy before it can destroy them. They pick fights over small things when the relationship feels too good. They pull away when someone gets genuinely close. They test people in ways designed to produce rejection, so that the rejection happens on their terms rather than unexpectedly. None of this is conscious. None of it is malicious. It is the nervous system doing its best to protect someone it has learned to believe is not safe to love or be loved by. Sudden illness before important events is a fear disguise that the body produces without the conscious mind's permission. A person who does not consciously recognize that they are terrified of a presentation, an audition, or a significant meeting will sometimes become genuinely physically unwell in the days before it. Headaches, stomach problems, fatigue so complete that functioning seems impossible. The body and brain are so deeply connected that psychological fear translates into physical symptoms with remarkable efficiency. The body is offering an exit that the mind didn't know it was seeking, and the exit feels medically legitimate, which makes it feel less like avoidance and more like misfortune. Busyness is one of the most culturally celebrated disguises fear wears. The person who is always busy, always scheduled, always responding, and managing, and attending, and producing is considered admirable in most modern environments. But busyness can be a highly sophisticated form of avoidance. When you fill every moment with activity, you never have to sit with the thing you are afraid of. You never have to face the quiet question of whether you are actually moving toward what matters or simply running very fast in an impressive circle. The busyness feels productive. The calendar looks full. And the thing that most needs attention never gets any. Recognizing fear's disguises requires developing what some call the pause practice, the ability to stop in the middle of an avoidance behavior and ask a genuinely curious question. Not a self-critical question, not what is wrong with me, but a curious one. What is happening here? What am I actually feeling beneath this? What would it mean to stop doing this thing and face directly what is underneath it? The pause is not comfortable. The honest answer is often uncomfortable too. But the uncomfortable, honest answer is infinitely more useful than the comfortable lie the disguise has been offering. Fear recognized is fear that can be worked with. This does not mean the fear disappears the moment you see it clearly. It does not always. But it changes character when it is exposed. Fear in disguise has enormous power because it operates undetected, pulling strings behind the scenes while you genuinely believe you are making free choices. Fear, without its disguise, is just a feeling, a strong feeling, sometimes an overwhelming one, but a feeling that can be acknowledged, explored, and gradually worked through in ways that disguised fear never allows. The seeing is not everything, but nothing useful starts before it. Chapter 4. The story you think is true. Every person is living inside a story. Not the story of what is objectively happening in their life, but the story of what those events mean. Who is to blame for the difficulties? What is possible going forward? And most critically, what kind of person they are. This story runs constantly in the background of experience, coloring everything that happens, and filtering out most of the information that contradicts it. The story is so continuous, so foundational, and so persuasive that most people never question whether it is true. They question whether their circumstances are good or bad. They question whether other people are treating them well or poorly. But the story itself, the deep inner narrative about who they are and what they deserve and what the world is like, that they accept without examination as simple reality. The stories people carry about themselves were mostly written during childhood, by circumstances they did not choose and could not fully understand at the time. A child who was criticized consistently writes a story about being inadequate. A child who was ignored writes a story about being unworthy of attention. A child who witnessed chaos writes a story about the world being unpredictable and people being unreliable. These stories made sense given the information available. They were adaptive. They helped the child navigate an environment they could not control. But the story written by a 7-year-old operating with incomplete information in a difficult situation is not necessarily an accurate description of a 35-year-old's actual reality. The problem is that the brain does not automatically update these foundational stories as the person grows and accumulates new information. Instead, it filters new information through the existing story. Confirmation bias, the tendency to notice and remember evidence that confirms what you already believe, while discounting evidence that contradicts it, is one of the most powerful and consistent phenomena in all of human psychology. The person who believes they are not smart will remember every mistake they make and forget every success. The person who believes they are unlovable will interpret a partner's tiredness as rejection and ignore the daily evidence of genuine care. There is a category of story that is particularly destructive because it sounds like wisdom. These are the limitation stories told in the first person with an air of self-awareness. I am just not a disciplined person. I have always been someone who struggles with relationships. I am not built for that kind of success. These statements feel honest. They feel like the speaker has done real reflection and arrived at accurate self-knowledge. But they are almost never accurate self-knowledge. They are calcified stories wearing the costume of humility and self-awareness. They feel wise because accepting a limitation feels less scary than confronting the possibility that the limitation is not fixed. Fixed versus growth mindset. The framework developed by psychologist Carol Dweck describes exactly this distinction. The person with a fixed mindset believes that qualities like intelligence, talent, and ability are stable traits you either have or do not have. The person with a growth mindset believes those qualities are developed through effort, practice, and willingness to fail and learn. The research on this difference is extensive and consistent. People with fixed mindsets avoid challenges, give up sooner when things get difficult, feel threatened by other people's success, and ultimately achieve less than their potential. People with growth mindsets embrace challenges, persist longer, learn from failure, and are inspired rather than threatened by others' success. But here is what makes the story framework so powerful and so difficult to work with. Telling a person with a deeply fixed mindset to simply adopt a growth mindset is like telling a person who has been in prison for 20 years to simply start living freely the moment the door opens. The story about what is possible is not a casual belief that can be updated by reading the right book or hearing the right speech. It is embedded in neural pathways built up over years of repeated experience and interpretation. Changing it requires something more than intellectual agreement. It requires new experiences that the old story cannot explain away, accumulated one by one until the weight of evidence begins to genuinely shift the narrative. One of the most useful exercises for examining your own foundational stories is something therapists sometimes call the downward arrow technique. You take a belief you hold about yourself, something like, I always mess up important things, and then you ask what that means to you. When you get an answer, you ask what that means, and you keep going down until you hit the bottom of the story. The core belief that everything above it has been built to protect and confirm. What you find at the bottom is almost always something that formed very early in life, something that made sense then and has been running the show ever since without being challenged. Revising a foundational story does not mean replacing it with a false positive version. It means holding it more loosely, treating it as a perspective rather than a fact, and actively looking for evidence that complicates the narrative rather than confirming it. The person whose story says they always fail looks, with effort, for the times they did not fail. Not to invalidate the story, but to make it more accurate, more nuanced, more honest. A more accurate story is not necessarily a prettier one, but it is a story that creates more space for the person inside it to move, to try, and to find out what is actually true about who they are. Chapter 5. Why you destroy what you build. It happens in careers. A person works hard, earns recognition, gets promoted, and then begins making decisions that seem almost designed to undermine everything they built. It happens in finances. Someone saves carefully, builds a cushion they have never had before, and then makes a series of impulsive purchases that bring them right back to where they started. It happens in health. A person loses weight through genuine, sustained effort, and then, as they approach their goal, the habits quietly dissolve and the weight returns. It happens in love. A relationship gets good, genuinely good, and then the person inside it starts picking it apart, pushing the partner away, creating conflict out of nothing until the goodness is gone. This pattern is so common that it has a clinical name. Psychologists call it self-defeating behavior, but most people just experience it as a mystery they cannot solve. The key to understanding why people destroy what they build lies in a concept called the upper limit problem, introduced by psychologist Gay Hendricks. The theory holds that every person has an internal thermostat set to a specific level of happiness, success, love, and abundance. When life rises above that set point, the unconscious mind triggers self-defeating behavior to bring the temperature back down to the familiar level. The set point is not a logical choice. It is an inherited emotional baseline, shaped by what felt normal during formative years and reinforced by every subsequent cycle of rise and fall. The upper limit trigger is almost never obvious in the moment it fires. The person does not sit down and consciously decide that things are going too well and need to be disrupted. The disruption arrives as an impulsive remark that damages an important relationship right when that relationship was deepening. It arrives as a sudden craving that breaks a streak of healthy choices. It arrives as an inexplicable bout of anxiety that arrives precisely when there is the least objective reason to be anxious. It arrives as picking a fight, breaking an agreement, or making a financial decision that undermines real stability. The trigger fires below conscious awareness and produces behavior that the conscious mind then has to rationalize after the fact. There is also the phenomenon psychologists call reaching a ceiling and then self-interrupting. Research on achievement behavior shows a consistent pattern. As people approach a meaningful goal, anxiety tends to increase rather than decrease, and the rate of self-sabotaging behavior rises alongside it. This seems counterintuitive. You would expect that getting close to something you want would feel good. But for many people, proximity to success activates fears that distance does not. The fear of what comes after success. the fear of not being able to sustain it, the fear that the success will reveal something insufficient about them that the striving had been hiding. Getting close to the goal removes the safety of working towards something and replaces it with the vulnerability of having arrived somewhere. Guilt plays a significant and often unexamined role in the destruction of good things. When a person builds something, a relationship, a career, a financial situation, a body that surpasses what the people they grew up with or the people they love have managed to achieve, an unconscious guilt can arise around that difference. Loyalty to the group, the family, the community, the class, runs deep in human psychology. Moving beyond what the group has achieved can feel like a kind of betrayal, like leaving people behind, like becoming someone who no longer fully belongs. And guilt, even unconscious guilt, is a powerful driver of self-sabotage. It motivates a person to cut themselves back down to a size that does not threaten the loyalty they feel. Another dimension of this pattern involves what happens to identity when success arrives. A person who has organized their identity around the struggle, the working toward, the not yet there, suddenly faces an identity crisis when they arrive. Who are they if they are no longer the person striving? What does their life mean if the goal they were chasing has been caught? These questions are not comfortable, and the mind will sometimes choose to destroy the achievement rather than face the existential uncertainty of having to figure out who you are when you are no longer reaching for it. The struggle, as painful as it was, had the advantage of being known. Breaking the pattern of destroying what you build requires first acknowledging that the pattern exists without judgment and without shame. Shame about self-sabotage is itself a form of self-sabotage, because shame activates the same avoidance mechanisms that created the problem in the first place. Instead, it requires curiosity. What specifically triggers the destruction? What is the feeling that arrives just before the behavior? What story is the mind telling in that moment about what is happening and what it means? The more precisely a person can identify the sequence, the more chance they have of interrupting it before it runs its full course. The ultimate antidote to the upper limit problem is expanding the internal set point, raising the baseline level of good that feels normal and safe rather than threatening. This does not happen through affirmations or visualization alone. It happens through repeated experience of staying with the good thing when the urge to destroy it arrives, of sitting with the discomfort of success and discovering that the disaster the brain predicted does not materialize. Each time a person tolerates a higher level of well-being without triggering self-destruction, the thermostat adjusts slightly upward. It is slow work. It requires genuine patience, but it is the only kind of work that actually moves the set point rather than simply working around it. Chapter 6. The Comparison Trap. Inside the Trap. Human beings are comparison machines, not because we are vain or insecure, though we can certainly be both, but because comparison is one of the primary ways the social brain calibrates where it stands in relation to the group. And that calibration was critical for survival throughout most of human evolution. The person who knew where they ranked in the social hierarchy, who was stronger, who had more resources, who was more respected, was better positioned to navigate the complex social landscape of early human communities. Comparison was information, but like so many evolutionary tools, Comparison in the modern world has become untethered from its original purpose and has turned into something that corrodes rather than informs. The specific way comparison becomes part of the mind's trap is through what psychologists call upward social comparison. This is the tendency, when measuring your own progress or worth, to measure against people who are further along, more accomplished, more successful, or seemingly better off. Done occasionally and strategically, upward comparison can be motivating. Seeing what is possible in someone else can expand your sense of what is possible for you. But done constantly and without awareness, upward comparison does something far more damaging. It makes whatever you have built and whatever you are building feel perpetually insufficient, no matter how much progress has actually been made. Social media has converted what was already a powerful cognitive bias into something closer to a 24-hour environmental condition. The average person now has access to curated highlight reels from hundreds or thousands of other people, most of whom are presenting the best version of their lives rather than the full version. The person scrolling through these feeds is not comparing their ordinary Tuesday to another person's ordinary Tuesday. They are comparing their raw, behind-the-scenes reality to everyone else's directed and edited performance. And then they are drawing conclusions from that comparison about the relative inadequacy of their own lives. There is a particular cruelty in the comparison trap for people working on genuine growth and change. Progress in real life is almost always slower, messier, and less linear than it looks from the outside. The person who changed their life dramatically looks, once the change is visible, like they accomplished it efficiently and smoothly. The years of failed attempts, the setbacks, the returns to old patterns, the long flat stretches where nothing seemed to be moving at all, those are invisible by the time the success story is ready to be told. So the person in the middle of their own messy process compares themselves to the polished, finished product of someone else's journey and concludes they are falling behind. Lateral comparison, comparing yourself to people at a similar stage of their own journey, is equally problematic in a different way. It produces the seductive feeling of competition in a race that nobody actually assigned you to run. The person in a similar position who seems to be moving faster becomes a threat rather than a fellow traveler. Their progress begins to feel like evidence of your inadequacy rather than simply their own work. And because the brain is now treating their advancement as threatening, you lose access to what could have been your greatest resource, which is learning from someone who is navigating similar terrain. The most damaging comparison is also the most invisible one, and it is the comparison between who you are now and who you think you should be by now. This internal comparison uses an imaginary standard, a projected version of the self that exists in an idealized timeline where all the right choices were made and no time was wasted. The gap between where you are and where that imagined self is feels like evidence of failure, but the imagined self is a fiction. It never existed. It never faced any of the actual circumstances that shaped your actual life. Comparing yourself to a person who never had your specific obstacles and never had to make your specific difficult choices is not a fair competition. It is a rigged game that you can only ever lose. Breaking the comparison habit does not require becoming indifferent to other people or closing yourself off to inspiration. It requires developing what some researchers call a personal standard orientation, which means measuring progress against your own previous position rather than against external benchmarks. The question shifts from am I further along than they are to am I further along than I was? This sounds simple, and the concept is. But in a world that constantly provides external comparison points and very rarely encourages internal ones, actually practicing this orientation requires deliberate and repeated effort against a strong cultural current. There is something surprisingly freeing about the moment a person genuinely drops out of the comparison race, not as a defeated withdrawal, but as a conscious decision to run a different kind of race entirely. The energy that was spent monitoring others, calculating relative positions, and managing the anxiety of feeling behind becomes available for actual work. The question of what other people are doing loses its urgency, and the question of what you are actually doing gains ground. Growth that was measured against an external moving target, and therefore always felt insufficient, begins to feel genuinely real when it is measured against where you actually started. Chapter 7. The Permission You Keep Waiting For. There is a thing that many people are waiting for without realizing they are waiting. They are waiting for permission. Not formal permission, not a document or a certificate or an official announcement. They are waiting for the internal sense that it is now acceptable to go after what they want, to claim the life they actually want to live, to step into the version of themselves that they have been privately imagining for years. They are waiting for the feeling that the time is right, that they are ready enough, that circumstances have aligned sufficiently to justify beginning. And the painful, costly truth about that waiting is this: the permission they are waiting for is never going to come from outside. It can only ever be given by the person waiting for it. The permission problem has deep roots in how most people learn to relate to authority during childhood. Children are necessarily dependent on adults for guidance about what is acceptable and appropriate. The child who wants to do something checks with a parent or teacher or other adult to find out if it is okay. This is developmentally appropriate and even necessary during childhood. But the habit of seeking permission before acting does not always dissolve as the person grows. It often simply shifts objects. Instead of asking a parent whether it is okay to pursue something, the grown adult asked an internalized authority, a vague but powerful sense of what other people will think, what society expects, what the rules are. Imposter syndrome is one of the most common forms the permission problem takes in adult life. The person with imposter syndrome is waiting for the feeling of being legitimate before they fully show up in their work, their relationships, or their ambitions. They are waiting to feel like they have earned the right to be taken seriously, to occupy the space they are actually occupying, to trust the knowledge and capability they have genuinely developed. But the feeling of legitimacy is one of the most consistently delayed arrivals in human psychology. It tends to come, when it comes at all, well after the person has been doing the thing for long enough that the evidence is overwhelming. Waiting for it before starting means waiting forever. Ready is another version of permission waiting that deserves its own examination. I will start when I am ready. I will make the move when the time is right. I will begin when I have enough knowledge, enough money, enough confidence, enough experience. These statements feel responsible. They feel like prudence rather than avoidance. But readiness, like legitimacy, is mostly a feeling. And it is a feeling that almost always lags behind the evidence. Most people who have done significant things in their lives will tell you that they did not feel ready when they began. They were uncertain, underprepared, and genuinely afraid. The readiness came from doing, not from waiting until the preconditions for readiness were met. There is also a specific kind of permission waiting that involves other people, and it operates in a way that can damage relationships without either party fully understanding what is happening. The person who cannot proceed with their own life until they have the approval of a partner, a parent, a friend, or a community is transferring the authority over their growth to someone else who was never supposed to hold it. And then, when that approval does not come, or comes with conditions, the relationship becomes charged with resentment about something neither party can cleanly articulate. The person feels blocked. The other feels blamed. And the real source of the blockage, the self-imposed need for external permission, remains unexamined. The waiting for permission often co-occurs with magical thinking about what will happen once the permission arrives. When I finally feel ready, things will be different. When the timing is right, everything will fall into place. When I get the green light from this person or that circumstance, the path will open up. This thinking is magical because it assigns to an external event the power to transform an internal state. But the internal state does not change because of external events. It changes because of internal work, internal decisions, and internal practice. The path does not open up when the timing feels right. The path gets made by the walking, even when the timing does not feel right at all. Giving yourself permission is an act, not a feeling that arrives, not a state you enter naturally when everything aligns. It is a deliberate choice to proceed without the validation, without the perfect circumstances, without the guarantee that things will work out. It is saying to yourself, I do not need to feel completely ready to begin. I do not need everyone to approve of this for it to be worth pursuing. I do not need the outcome to be certain in order to justify the attempt. This is not recklessness. It is the recognition that the certainty you are waiting for is a myth, and that the only people who actually move forward are the ones who figured that out and decided to move anyway. The moment of genuine self-permission is one of the most significant moments in a person's growth, precisely because it cannot be faked. You know the difference between genuinely deciding to move and telling yourself you have decided while still secretly waiting for something to make the decision feel safer. The genuine decision has a quality of release in it. Something that was held tightly gets let go. The waiting, which had been masquerading as patience or prudence, reveals itself as what it was, a way of staying small while looking like someone who was almost ready to be bigger. And once you see it that way, it becomes much harder to keep choosing it. Chapter 8. The people who keep you small. Not everyone in your life is rooting for your growth. This is one of the harder truths that a person working on genuine change has to come to terms with. And it is harder because the people who inadvertently keep you small are very often people you love. People who love you in return. And people who would be genuinely hurt and confused to be told that their presence makes your growth harder. They are not villains. They are people operating from their own fears, their own losses, their own self-interest, and sometimes their own limited understanding of what you are capable of. But their impact is real, regardless of their intention. And failing to understand that impact is one of the most common ways that genuine growth gets derailed. The dynamic operates most clearly within families. Family systems develop equilibrium, a particular arrangement of roles and behaviors and expectations that everyone in the family unconsciously maintains, because that arrangement is what the family knows. When one member of the system begins to change significantly, the rest of the system feels the disturbance, and, often without knowing it, begins exerting pressure to restore the equilibrium. The sibling who gets more education than anyone in the family gets subtle messages that they are getting above themselves. The child who sets boundaries in a family where no one had any becomes the problem child. The person who leaves a shared toxic pattern behind gets told they are abandoning the people who love them. Friends can perform a similar function, particularly friends who share the specific struggle a person is working to leave behind. A social group built around a shared limitation has an investment in that limitation, even when no one would consciously choose it. The group of people who bond over not having made it, over being outsiders, over their shared contempt for the mainstream, can become a kind of trap in itself. When one member of that group begins moving toward something different, the group's identity is threatened. The response is often mockery, dismissal, or the subtle accusation of betrayal that comes dressed as concern about whether the person has changed for the worse. Romantic partners are perhaps the most complicated version of this dynamic, because the relationship itself can become a mirror of self-limiting beliefs in ways that feel like love rather than limitation. The partner who needs you to stay uncertain is providing proof that you need them to help you be sure. The partner who is threatened by your competence subtly discourages the exercise of it. The partner who became attracted to your vulnerability may find themselves destabilized by your increasing strength. None of this is simple, and none of it is anyone's fault in a straightforward sense. But it is real, and the person who is growing inside a relationship where the growth is unwelcome faces a genuine and painful choice. There is also a category of person whose limiting effect is more internal than external. These are the people whose judgment you have internalized so deeply that they exert influence even when they are not in the room, even when they are no longer alive, even when you have not seen them in years. The critical parent, whose voice lives in your head 30 years later. The teacher who told you that you were not academic and whom you still hear whenever you sit down to write or study. The ex-partner whose contempt you still feel in your chest when you try something ambitious and it doesn't immediately work. These internalized voices are among the most powerful limiters in a person's life because they operate from inside the architecture of your own self-perception. The question of what to do about the people who keep you small does not have a single clean answer, and anyone who tells you it does is oversimplifying something genuinely complex. It is not always possible or right to remove people from your life simply because their presence creates friction around your growth. Some of those people are people you love and are committed to. Some of them are people who will themselves grow and change if given time and the right conditions. The more important first step, before making any external decisions, is to see the dynamic clearly, without blame and without the distortion that comes from either idealizing the relationship or demonizing the other person. Protecting your growth within relationships requires developing a kind of inner sanctum, a place inside yourself where your goals and your developing sense of self are not up for negotiation or community review. You can love people deeply and still not grant them access to the parts of you that are forming, still tender, still vulnerable to being talked out of existence by well-meaning doubt or poorly meaning ridicule. This is not dishonesty or secrecy. It is discernment about where to put the most important things while they are still fragile enough to need protection from the forces that would diminish them before they are strong enough to stand on their own. The clearest test of whether a relationship is helping or hindering your growth is simple, but requires honesty to apply. After spending time with this person, do you feel expanded or contracted? Do you leave the interaction with more clarity about who you are becoming and more energy to move toward it? Or do you leave smaller, more doubtful, more resigned to the version of yourself that the relationship reflects back? This test is not about finding perfect people or relationships. It is about developing the self-awareness to know which relationships are investing in who you are becoming and which ones are quietly shorting that investment and adjusting accordingly. Chapter 9. Habits that wear the mask of identity. At some point in a person's life, a behavior they repeat often enough stops being something they do and becomes something they are. The person who stays up late every night stops being someone who stays up late and becomes a night person. The person who avoids confrontation consistently stops being someone who avoids conflict and becomes a non-confrontational person. The person who procrastinates on important tasks stops being someone who procrastinates and becomes someone who is just not disciplined. The behavior calcifies into identity. And once something is identity, it is defended very differently than when it was just a habit. You might change a habit, but who you are is supposed to be permanent. This fusion of habit and identity is one of the most effective mechanisms the mind's trap uses to resist change. As long as a limiting behavior is understood as simply something you do, it can be examined, questioned, and replaced. Once it becomes who you are, any attempt to change it feels like an attack on the self rather than an adjustment to a behavior pattern. The person who tries to change a procrastinator identity feels existentially threatened by the attempt, not just behaviorally challenged by it. The defenses go up faster. The resistance is stronger. And the failure to sustain change seems to confirm that this really is just who they are, which tightens the trap another notch. The process by which behaviors become identities tends to start with a story told about an experience. A child fails a math test and an adult tells them they are just not a math person. The label takes hold. The child stops trying as hard because the identity of not being a math person has been established, and effort now feels pointless since the limitation is apparently innate. In the years that follow, every difficulty with math confirms the identity, and every success gets rationalized away as a fluke. By the time the person is an adult, they genuinely believe they can do math. Not because this is true, but because they stopped practicing math at a critical period and then had decades to accumulate evidence in support of a story that was never actually accurate. Carol Dweck's research on mindset, mentioned earlier in this book, is directly relevant here. But there is a more granular piece of her findings that specifically addresses the habit-identity fusion. She found that the most limiting identities are the ones that use the verb to be rather than the verb to do. When you say, "I am a bad communicator," rather than "I do not yet communicate well," you are treating the limitation as a state of being rather than a skill level. States of being cannot be trained. Skill levels can. The difference in phrasing feels minor, but it carries a completely different set of implications about what is possible going forward. Identity-level habits also protect themselves through social performance. The night owl does not just sleep late. They talk about being a night owl. They build their schedule around it. They tell others about it as a personality trait rather than a preference. They surround themselves with other night owls who confirm that this is simply who they are. The habit gets socialized into a social identity that now requires consistency for the sake of belonging, as well as for the sake of internal coherence. Changing the habit now threatens not just the self-image, but the social positioning, which adds another layer of resistance that has nothing to do with the original behavior. Changing a habit that has become an identity requires a different strategy than the ones typically recommended for simple habit change. The trick that works for most behavior habits make the desired behavior easier and the unwanted behavior harder is insufficient when the behavior is entangled with who you believe you are. What the research suggests works better is identity-based habit formation, which means starting with the identity you want to embody and then finding the smallest possible behaviors that are consistent with that identity. Not "I want to become a fit person, so I will force myself to the gym every day," but "I am someone who moves their body. What is the smallest way I can do that today?" The key distinction in identity-based change is that you are not trying to force yourself to change who you are. You are trying to discover who you actually are beneath the calcified habits. The habits are not the person. They are what the person practiced until it became automatic. And beneath the practiced patterns is a self that is more flexible, more capable, and more genuinely complex than any single label allows. Finding that self requires being willing to hold the identity label lightly enough to question it, which is not a small thing to ask, but it is the thing that makes real transformation possible. Every action you take is a vote for a particular identity. This framing, offered by researcher James Clear, reorients the entire conversation about habits. If you want to become someone who writes regularly, every day you write for even 10 minutes is a vote for that identity. If you want to become someone who handles difficult conversations with grace, every time you pause before reacting is a vote for that identity. You are not waiting to become the person before you can take the action. The action is how the person gets built. And that building happens vote by vote, in moments small enough to feel negligible, adding up over time into something that could legitimately be called a new self. Chapter 10. When you punish yourself for growing. There is a form of self-punishment that operates specifically around growth, and it is so embedded in the way many people relate to themselves that they do not recognize it as punishment at all. They recognize it as honesty. They experience it as just being realistic about who they are and what they deserve. But what is actually happening beneath the language of honesty and realism is a systematic process of undermining progress at exactly the moments when that progress threatens to become real. It is subtle, it is relentless, and it is one of the most effective mechanisms the mind's trap has for keeping people in a particular place, regardless of how hard they work to move. The self-punishment around growth can arrive in many forms. It arrives when someone receives genuine praise and immediately redirects the conversation to everything they still lack. It arrives when a goal is met, and instead of any moment of acknowledgement, the internal critic immediately escalates to the next inadequacy. It arrives in the form of guilt about enjoying success when others are still struggling. It arrives as a vague but persistent sense that feeling good about your own progress is arrogant or naive or will be punished by circumstances. It arrives most powerfully in the private language that runs inside the head, the commentary that accompanies every achievement, every attempt, and every moment of genuine forward movement. The roots of this self-punishing tendency around growth are often in early experiences with authority figures who responded to a child's success with criticism, deflation, or comparison. The child who comes home proud of an accomplishment and is met with a list of ways it could have been better learns something important about the social danger of feeling good about themselves. The child who is told repeatedly that confidence is the same as arrogance learns to preemptively deflate their own success before anyone else can do it. The child who grows up watching a parent punish themselves relentlessly absorbs that as the model for how a responsible, self-aware person is supposed to treat their own achievements. There is also a theological and cultural dimension to self-punishment around growth that operates in many communities without being explicitly named. The idea that suffering is virtuous, that comfort is suspect, that wanting too much is a moral failing, that humility requires minimizing oneself. These ideas are not just personal psychology. They are taught, sometimes explicitly, and sometimes through the texture of how people around the growing child talk about ambition, success, and the desire for more than what one has been given. Internalizing these cultural messages does not make them true, but it makes them feel like moral facts rather than inherited perspectives, which makes them far harder to examine. Self-compassion research, pioneered by psychologist Kristin Neff, consistently finds that people who treat themselves with kindness when they fail and when they succeed actually perform better, persist longer, and experience less anxiety and depression than people who use harsh self-criticism as a motivational strategy. This finding surprises many people because there is a widespread belief that self-criticism is necessary for high performance. That if you are too kind to yourself, you will lose your edge, become complacent, and stop working hard. The research does not support this belief. Self-compassion does not create complacency. It creates a psychological safety that makes sustained effort and genuine risk-taking more rather than less possible. The specific application of self-compassion to moments of growth and success requires breaking what many people experience as an ingrained reflex. When something good happens, when progress is made, when a goal is achieved, the internal critic fires before the acknowledgement has a chance to land. The trick is not to silence the critic by force, which rarely works, but to simply slow down the sequence. Before the critic gets its turn, take one breath and let the achievement be real for a moment. Not an exaggerated celebration, just a moment of genuine acknowledgement that something was done, that effort produced a result, that this matters. That moment, practiced regularly, is itself a form of rewiring. The permission to take up space, to feel good about growth, to acknowledge your own progress, without immediately qualifying it back to nothing, is not a permission anyone else can grant. It has to come from inside. And for many people, practicing it feels uncomfortable in a way that reveals exactly how deeply the prohibition was installed. If allowing yourself a moment of genuine satisfaction about your own growth feels wrong, that feeling of wrongness is itself the thing worth examining. It is the internal voice of an old authority that decided, for reasons that made sense once and do not make sense now, that your growth and your well-being were things that needed to be managed down rather than celebrated. The long-term cost of punishing yourself for growing is not just emotional, it is strategic. A person who cannot acknowledge their own progress has a distorted map of where they are in relation to where they want to go. They keep working as though they are at the beginning when they are actually much further along. They keep treating themselves as though they are inadequate when the evidence of their actual life says something much more complicated and generous. And they deny themselves the fuel that genuine acknowledgement provides, the real, grounded confidence that comes not from pep talks, but from honestly looking at what has been built and saying, "This is real, I did this, and it matters." Chapter 11. Building momentum when nothing is moving. There will be stretches where nothing seems to be working. You are doing the right things, or trying to, and yet the results are not coming. The needle is not moving. The effort is real, but the evidence of that effort is invisible or impossibly slow. These stretches are not occasional in the process of genuine growth. They are structural. They are built into how change actually works in human beings. And how a person handles these flat periods determines more about their ultimate trajectory than almost anything else about the way they approach growth. The first thing to understand about periods of apparent stagnation is that they are usually not actually stagnant. Below the surface, where the visible results would appear, if they were ready, significant work is often happening. Research on skill acquisition has consistently shown that learning does not happen linearly. Plateaus are part of the process, not departures from it. The pianist who feels like they are stuck for weeks and then suddenly breaks through to a new level of playing was not wasted during the plateau. The plateau was the period when the skill was being consolidated at a deeper level before it could manifest as visible performance. The challenge with flat periods is that the brain's threat detection system does not understand this distinction. It sees no external progress and generates an alarm. The alarm gets interpreted as evidence that something is wrong, that the approach is not working, that perhaps this goal was never achievable in the first place. And the person who listens to that alarm and changes their approach gives up or dramatically escalates their effort in a way that is more about anxiety than strategy, often disrupts the very consolidation process that was quietly building the next level of capability. The worst time to abandon a strategy is often precisely when it feels like it is not working. Momentum, when you are in a flat period, has to be manufactured rather than felt, because momentum does not feel like momentum in the middle of the flat stretch. It feels like going through the motions, like doing the thing because you said you would do the thing, not because you can feel it adding up to anything. This manufactured consistency is actually one of the most valuable skills a person working on growth can develop. It is the practice of taking the action, regardless of the presence of motivation, regardless of the visible result, regardless of the feelings of futility that flat periods reliably generate. One practical strategy for building momentum in flat periods is what researchers call the minimum viable action. Instead of requiring yourself to perform the full version of your growth practice on the days when energy and motivation are absent, you identify the absolute minimum version of the action that still counts. The writer who cannot produce their usual 500 words writes one paragraph. The person building a fitness habit who cannot face the full workout does 10 minutes. The professional working on a difficult skill does one focused repetition. The minimum viable action keeps the streak alive, keeps the identity vote being cast, and keeps the neural pathway open for the day when the energy returns. Community becomes especially important during flat periods precisely because the individual's internal measurement system is so unreliable at those times. When you cannot see your own progress, someone else who has watched your journey might be able to. When your own assessment of whether it is worth continuing has been corroded by the flat stretch, someone who believes in what you are building can hold that belief on your behalf for a while. This is not about needing external validation to function. It is about recognizing that humans evolved to navigate difficult periods in community rather than alone, and there is no virtue in refusing that resource when it is available. Redefining what counts as progress during flat periods also helps enormously. When visible results are the only metric, flat periods feel like failure by definition. But progress can be measured in ways that remain available even when results are not. Did you show up today when you did not feel like it? That is progress. Did you choose the growth-oriented response over the easy, familiar one in a moment, where either was available? That is progress. Did you notice a self-sabotage pattern earlier than you used to and intervene before it ran its full course? That is significant progress. The metrics of character and habit and self-awareness remain available even when the metrics of external achievement have temporarily gone quiet. Every person who has built something significant in their life has a flat period story. They are not the exception. They are the rule. The person who eventually broke through will describe a stretch where nothing seemed to be happening, and they did not know if they should keep going. What made the difference was almost never a dramatic intervention or a sudden burst of inspiration. It was the decision, made repeatedly and often without feeling good about it, to continue. That decision, sustained through the flat period, is what allowed them to be in position when the breakthrough finally came. The flat period does not last forever, but you have to still be there when it ends. Chapter 12. Escaping the Trap for Good. You have been reading about the trap long enough now to know that escaping it is not a single event. There is no one morning you wake up and the trap is simply gone. The architecture that was described in the first chapter, the ancient brain wiring, the early formed stories, the habits mistaken for identity, the fear wearing disguises, the internal critics and external limiters, none of that dismantles overnight. What changes over time and with sustained effort is your relationship to all of it. The trap does not disappear, but you stop living inside it as if its walls are the boundary of reality. The first thing that genuine escape requires is a tolerance for the discomfort of change that is different from what most people start with. Most people who begin working on their own growth do so with the expectation that working on themselves will eventually feel better, that the practice will become comfortable, that they will reach a point where the resistance subsides and growth becomes natural and easy. This expectation is partially correct. Some things genuinely do get easier with practice. But the frontier of growth is always at the edge of the current comfort zone, which means that real ongoing growth always involves some degree of discomfort. The person who is escaping the trap learns to recognize the discomfort of growth as a signal that they are moving, rather than a signal that something is wrong. Developing a more accurate relationship with time is another dimension of genuine escape. The trap is sustained in part by the expectation that change should be faster than it is. The person who expects to transform in weeks and finds themselves still working through the same patterns in months concludes that they are failing when they are actually simply operating in the actual timeline of human change. Neurons that have been firing together for decades do not rewire in a season. Patterns that formed in childhood do not dissolve after a month of new thinking. The realistic timeline for deep change is years, not weeks, and making peace with that timeline is not giving up. It is choosing to stay in the work long enough for the work to actually land. The relationship you have with failure changes fundamentally when the trap starts to lose its grip. Inside the trap, failure is evidence. It confirms the story, it validates the fear, it justifies the avoidance. Outside the trap, failure is data. It reveals something specific about what did not work, which points toward what might. This does not mean failure stops hurting. Real failure at things that matter causes real pain, and it should. The difference is what the pain means and what you do with it. The person outside the trap feels the pain of failure, takes what can be learned from it, and continues. The person inside the trap feels the same pain and uses it to justify the decision to stop trying. Self-knowledge, genuine and continually updated self-knowledge, is the most reliable long-term protection against the trap. Not self-knowledge in the service of self-criticism. Not the kind of self-knowledge that produces a long list of your limitations and deficiencies, but the kind that allows you to see your own patterns with enough clarity and enough compassion to work with them rather than being controlled by them. The person who knows that they upper limit when things are going well can prepare for the upper limiting impulse and intervene before it runs. The person who knows their fear wears a specific disguise can recognize the costume before they are too deep inside the avoidance to see it. The role of consistent community in long-term escape from the trap cannot be overstated. Not online community or casual acquaintance community, but genuine people in genuine relationship who have seen you at your most limited and most expanded, and who are invested in the version of you that is growing. These people do not need to be numerous. Even 1 or 2 relationships of this quality can provide the kind of sustained witness that makes long-term change sustainable. They remember who you were when you cannot. They hold the vision of who you are becoming when you have temporarily lost sight of it. They call you forward rather than confirming your limitations. One of the clearest signs that the trap is losing its hold is a change in the quality of your inner conversation. The harsh, all-or-nothing internal critic that characterized the early stages of self-sabotage begins to soften, not into absence, but into something more nuanced, more contextual, more honest. Instead of "you always mess this up," something closer to this did not work as well as you hoped. What can be learned? Instead of "you are too far behind to catch up." Something more like "you are in the middle of a long process, and today was one day of it." The change in tone is not artificial positivity. It is the voice of a mind that has genuinely grown more accurate in how it talks about reality. The trap was built from the belief that you needed it. That belief was not entirely wrong. It served a function once, a real function in a real context. But the context has changed, and the belief has not kept up. Escaping the trap is not about rejecting the part of you that built it. That part was doing its best with what it had. It is about updating the assessment, about deciding, in the clearest and most grounded way possible, that the protection the trap offered is no longer worth the growth it costs. That decision, made honestly and held patiently through all the moments when the trap pulls back toward its familiar walls, is not the end of anything. It is the most honest beginning you will ever make.